Hello, everyone. My name is Jen. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Thank you for joining us today for our book talk, Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. Some of you may know that one of our current exhibits is Coffee, a Connecticut Story, and it explores our state's connection to coffee across time and space. And the exhibit is actually in its last leg. It closes January 25th. So we thought for a final program, a discussion by Michelle Craig McDonald about her recently published book, Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States, would just be a perfect fit for the occasion. So we're really excited to have Michelle today. Michelle is the director of the Library and Museum for the American Philosophical Society, and her research focuses on trade and consumer behavior in North America and the Caribbean during the 18th and 19th centuries. This most recent book, Coffee Nation, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in May of 2025, and it is based on research supported by the Fulbright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the Winterthur Library and Museum. In addition to her doctorate from the University of Michigan, she holds an MA in liberal arts from St. John's College, Annapolis, and an MA in museum studies from George Washington University, and a BA in history from the University of California, Los Angeles. Michelle was the Harvard Newcomen postdoctoral fellow in business history at the Harvard Business School. And we are really delighted to have you tonight, Michelle. So welcome. And I will stop talking.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History for having me, and Jen in particular for all of the arrangements that she made for this evening. And of course, all of you for choosing to spend part of this evening with me. So I am going to start a PowerPoint because I have some fun images to accompany the talk. I look forward to the conversation. And then, of course, I really look forward to the discussion and the Q of A. Before I start the formal presentation, I want to begin, as most historians do, with a story. And it's a story that's going to have some elements that seem familiar, and then other elements that might be a little more surprising. So I am hoping, there we go, that we can start here. All right, so women began to gather in front of a warehouse in Boston early on the morning of July 24th in 1777. Now, this was just over a year after the North American 13 colonies had declared their independence. At first, there were only a few women. By mid-morning, there were dozens of women, and by the time that the building's owner, a man named Thomas Boylston, arrived, over 100 women were gathered there to greet him. For years, the city's residents had been complaining about the cost of their groceries, and not without good reason, because since Boston had passed its non-importation agreement to protest the Townshend duties in 1768, the price of everything had skyrocketed. And the situation, of course, only got worse after the outbreak of war. Abigail Adams was living in Boston at this time while her husband John was working in Philadelphia. And she frequently wrote to him about the challenges of living in a city that was under siege, as well as Bostonians' growing irritation with merchants and with importers and shopkeepers. There is, she wrote, a general cry against the merchants who, 'tis said, have created a partial scarcity, not only for luxuries, but even for the necessaries of life. Now, the women who were confronting Boylston in Boston that morning in 1777 had one very specific necessary of life in mind, and that was coffee. Today, coffee is traded worldwide. Uh, it is so common that its popularity is often taken for granted. But even everyday habits, of course, have a history. And when and why coffee became part of North Americans' daily life is at the center of Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. I'm often asked why I chose to write a book about coffee, and the answer is honestly, it happened by accident. My first semester in graduate school, I took a course in early British history, and at that point, I thought I was going to be studying the history of public education in the United States as it emerged after the Civil War. I did not. That is not even close to what I chose to study. But because I was interested in education, I thought that I would look at what I was calling public literacy, or how people who didn't read and write kept up with the news. And this took me to places like taverns and inns and coffee houses because this is where news was often read aloud and debated and shared. Now, the next semester, my second semester in graduate school, I took a class in Atlantic history, which explores how Europe and Africa and the Americas became interwoven from the 15th century on. And since I was already reading about coffee houses, I thought that I would take a look at how coffee was produced. I also thought so much has been written about Caribbean history, but from the perspective of sugar production, why not explore coffee? And this is what I found. While consumer historians have studied how and where coffee became popular in different parts of the world, most of their work is written as if the coffee just appeared there, ready to be consumed. But by the same token, the books that have been written about coffee production, and most of them focus, understandably so, on Latin America in particular, and they go into a lot of detail about how coffee is grown and how it's harvested and packaged and prepared for shipping. But their story usually ends at the docks with coffee being ready to be shipped abroad. Rarely did these two literatures speak to each other. They weren't citing each other. They weren't really engaging with each other. And that's how Coffee Nation came to be. It's a really broad history that follows history, or coffee rather, from its first domestication in Ethiopia through Middle Eastern trade routes and farming experiments in the East Indies, and eventually across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean, and from there to the stores and the dining rooms and the export warehouses of North America, which became, within 50 years of independence, one of the largest suppliers of coffee to the world. Not just one of the biggest consumers, one of the largest suppliers of coffee to the world. Now, this was not an especially easy project, and I think I might have been more intimidated from the outset if I'd known the kind of work this was going to become. The reason why it wasn't so easy is because there are no big coffee merchants. This is why the screen is necessarily blank at the moment. There were no big coffee merchants in the 18th century in the way that there were sugar merchants or linen merchants or wine merchants, men and whose businesses were devoted, right, to moving this commodity around the world. Instead, I had to weave together this history from a variety of different sources, from brief notices that some number of barrels or bags had arrived into port, or that friends had met for coffee in each other's homes, or had gone to the coffee house for the latest political news, and through glimpses in account books, in letters and diaries and newspaper advertisements, and in the case of smuggling, in court records. But the sheer volume of these references, the numbers of times that coffee shows up in these records, really demonstrates its omnipresence in colonial America and in the young United States. And it quickly becomes very apparent that the drink is everywhere if you care to look. So this evening, I have chosen 6 people from my book to help me tell this story. And each one of them represents a different aspect of coffee's history: its cultivation, its trade, its consumption, its politics, smuggling, and advertising. So we start with this gentleman. Sir Nicholas Laws served as Jamaica's colonial governor from 1718 to 1722. Now, he'd grown up on a sugar plantation on the island, but his family's economic success meant that, like many wealthy planting families, he had lived most of his adult life in England. He returned to Jamaica because the island was in trouble. Years of administrative mismanagement had resulted in a government that was riddled with corruption and a colony that was very deeply in debt. During his first 2 years in office, Laws wrote more than 40 letters and shipping reports and depositions to Parliament documenting everything from Spanish Cuba's attacks on British ships and efforts to track down and recapture runaway enslaved people who had escaped into Jamaica's mountainous interior. In his last 2 years as governor, he helped the island weather the impact of what was a devastating hurricane and presided over the trials of Captain Jack Rackham, otherwise known as the celebrated Calico Jack, and 10 others who were accused of piracy. So it's little wonder that in 1722, at the age of 70, all Laws wanted to do was return to his plantation and his botanical experiments. And he died less than a decade after he left office. But in his final years in Jamaica, he left the island a legacy that proved more enduring than his efforts to staunch smuggling or provide hurricane relief or prosecute pirates. And that's because in 1728, Laws planted Jamaica's first coffee trees, forever changing the island's economy, its community, and its landscape, as well as, of course, the lives of thousands of enslaved Africans and Afro-Jamaican workers who will be coerced into this new commodity system. Now, Laws only lived to see the first few harvests, but the crop was promising enough that more than 20 of his fellow planters, including, by the way, 3 women, petitioned Parliament back in London for support. And Whitehall responded in 1732 with what you see on the screen here, an act for encouraging the growth of coffee in His Majesty's plantations in America. And it was the first of several laws that paved the way for cultivation to grow in the British West Indies. The results are readily apparent in the shift from coffee production from east until west over the course of the 18th century. So what I've done here is to show you several snapshots of where coffee is coming from when it moves through the British Empire. And you can see that at the turn of the 17th into the 18th century, most of the coffee is coming either from the Levant or from the East Indies. There have been experiments by the French, the English, and the Dutch to grow coffee in places like Java or Bourbon or Ceylon. That begins to shift. Just first of all, the volume of coffee grows as you get up to 1722 and 1749. But by the last figure, and I hope you can move the little boxes around so you can see it, by 1722 or 1774, on the cusp of the American Revolution, there has been a significant both increase in the amount of coffee produced and real shift from east to west in terms of where it's coming from. The results of Britain's decision to invest in Caribbean coffee were very easy to see, especially on the record books of someone like William West, who is the second person I want to introduce you to this evening. William West was a merchant who lived in Philadelphia, and in April of 1765, he was waiting at the Philadelphia docks, scanning the harbor for the arrival of a ship named the Polly. The Polly had set sail from Kingston, Jamaica, carrying casks of coffee and sugar and bags of limes and barrels of rum. And nothing about this journey is particularly remarkable. The goods were very common island exports, popular with North American buyers, and the route that the ship traveled was sailed by hundreds of vessels in and out of Philadelphia that year alone. The West family had come to America from Ireland in 1750, and William West Jr. would ultimately become a captain in the 3rd Pennsylvania Regiment during the American Revolution. But that morning, he wasn't thinking about war. It wasn't really a glimmer in his imagination. Instead, he was waiting for his share of the Polly's coffee, which he would then send on to Charleston, South Carolina. Other casks on the same ship were owned by William Redmond, who was another Philadelphia merchant, and they would go as far north as Newport, Rhode Island. But most of the coffee that the Polly brought into port was owned by a local firm named Craig, Fuller, and Ash, and it would be sold in Philadelphia and nearby towns in Pennsylvania New Jersey, and Delaware. Philadelphia, as the exhibition in your museum amply testifies, was not the only city to import coffee, of course, in North America, but it did bring in the most. This principal port of Pennsylvania had entered the West India market later than both New York and Boston, which had developed very strong networks into the sugar and the rum trades since the early 18th century. So instead of trying to compete, Philadelphia's traders began testing interest in several goods that they collectively came to call the secondary commodities. And by this, they mean ginger, pimento, pepper, but especially coffee, which accounted for at least, in fact, Philadelphia alone accounted for at least a third, and in some years, up to half of the coffee that was coming into North America by the 1760s. To see who bought it, because I was interested in production, but I'm also interested in distribution. To see who bought it, I looked at tax lists, city directories, and newspaper advertisements. And this last source was especially helpful. The number of vendors, this is what you see in the chart here. The number of vendors selling coffee almost doubles between 1765 and 1775. But just as important to me wasn't just that the number of people selling coffee was increasing, but where in the city they were selling it. About a third of the newspaper advertisements were based in, and what I have on the far side of the screen are the wards: High Street Ward, Chestnut Ward, Walnut Ward. This is how the city is developed, distributed into neighborhoods in Philadelphia. About a third of coffee sellers were in High Street and Chestnut and Walnut Ward. These were the districts that are closest to the city's ports and its largest public markets. So that's to be expected. Another third of these sellers had businesses in North, Middle, and South wards, and these were the principal business districts as well as home to some of the city's most affluent residents. So that's not especially surprising either. But coffee was also sold in upper and lower wards, which were working class neighborhoods. This is where sailors and longshoremen and other occupations affiliated with shipping lived. Admittedly, they might have developed their taste for coffee abroad, but even Mulberry Ward and Dock Ward, which were homes to some of the most marginal communities, think single and widowed women, as well as most of Philadelphia's free black community, had stores that advertised coffee. In other words, what these patterns tell me is that anyone who lived in any part of Philadelphia and who wanted to buy coffee was within walking distance of doing so. And all of these coffee drinkers benefited from the commercial networks that were created by people like William West Jr. and his fellow merchants, which helped to create a market in North America that tied the plantations from Governor Lowndes' initial experiments in the West Indies to those markets in North America. But they also meant that North American markets were going to be tied to Europe because England, especially, but also France and sometimes in Holland, produced most of the ceramics and the metalwares that were used to brew coffee and to serve coffee, as well as printed the advice literature and the recipe books that told people how to produce it, how to prepare it, and how to serve it. And those were among the major concerns of our third person this evening, Jane Shippen. Now, social custom is precisely what Jane was worried about when she wrote to her husband Joseph in 1772 about a trip she was taking to visit relatives in Lancaster. The Shippens were part of a large and very powerful, influential network of families, of merchants, of doctors, of lawyers, of landowners, of office holders in Pennsylvania's colonial government. Overall, Jane thought the visit was going fairly well. The home was lovely, the company was delightful, if a little provincial, but she took pains to alert her husband to what she considered to be a serious social gaffe. Her hosts, it seemed, would routinely put out fewer coffee cups than there were guests, and remedied the situation by substituting teacups. I know. This reminded Jane that half of her own coffee set was cracked or chipped, and she implored Joseph to please buy replacements so that she would not face a similar dilemma. What Jane's letter illustrates to me is several things, but at least a couple really important points. One is that the rules of etiquette and distinction were coming into play, right? Some families could afford complete coffee sets, while others were less picky about these kinds of conventions, and so simply mixed and matched crockery to make do. Put another way, more and more people are drinking coffee, but they're not drinking it the same way. They had options, right? At the very top of the market was sterling silver, and this set was fashioned by a man named Joseph Richardson Jr., who was one of the preeminent silversmiths in Philadelphia. It was recently, until this last week, on view at the American Philosophical Society in our exhibition this year called Philadelphia, the Revolutionary City. Sadly, we had to give it back. It didn't belong to us. It belonged to the Reading Museum, but I envied it and I visited it on a regular basis because it is gorgeous. If you couldn't afford sterling, though, which was very expensive, you could by the late 19th century or 18th century. Think about silver plate. So silver plate offered the look of pure silver. And in fact, with the advent of Sheffield plating, which bonded silver to copper and small amounts of zinc and lead, coffee pots could be plated on the inside as well as the outside. That means it became nearly impossible for the casual observer to be able to tell the difference, right? You could pick the pot up, you could look at the bottom, you could open the lid, you could look inside. It would all look like silver to you. The only way you would really know the difference is if you understood your metals. Silver plate is not nearly as heavy as sterling silver, but you'd really have to pick it up and then weigh it and then, cast in a glance at your host or hostess, by which time you were probably breaking other social etiquette rules, if you were that nosy. And if you couldn't afford silver, sterling, or plate, there were lots of other options, right? You could have a coffee pot fashioned of Chinese export porcelain, of ceramic, of stoneware, of creamware, which, by the way, was not at all just cream. Think about tortoiseshell ware, which is the second example in on this slide, or cauliflower ware. So many coffee pots made of vegetables. There are cauliflowers, there are broccolis, there are corn, there's tomatoes, there's carrots, eggplants. I don't know why. But they were really into vegetable pouring devices, or even painted tin, which ensured that there were ample displaying options, ways to craft your own sense of style with your coffee serviceware, to all ranks of coffee drinkers. And shipments from family and friends abroad could also help to fill the gaps. This is a letter from Benjamin Franklin, from London in 1758, writing to his wife, Deborah. Uh, by the way, for those of you who don't know the American, I would normally ask people when I'm giving a talk, how many of you have been to the American Philosophical Society? But since I can't see you all on the screen, I'm not going to ask that question. But we were founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 as North America's first learned society. In any event, 1758, he's writing home from London and he's describing the gifts that he's sending to Deborah, including a beer jug, which he thought looked like a fat, jolly dame, clean and tidy, with a neat blue and white calico gown on, good-natured and lovely, which put him in mind of somebody. I sincerely hope that somebody was Deborah. If it was not, he would have something to reckon with when he came home. But packed within that jar, in what he called the best crystal salt, pink crystal salt for added protection, were coffee cups, decorated with figures that Franklin urged Deborah to study closely with your spectacles on as they bear examining. Underlying this growing interest in coffee, however, was a persistent reliance on the international and imperial marketplace. Just as North American colonists imported their beans, they also needed to import most of their coffee pots, their sugar bowls, their cream pitchers, their spoons, whether fashioned of silver, porcelain, or ceramic, We didn't have actually a strong ceramic production in North America, consistent north until at the end of the 18th century, and really not until the 19th century in any meaningful way. British North American colonists, in other words, depended on others to grow their coffee, to ship their coffee, as well as to produce almost everything needed to prepare and to serve it. And it was an extensive and it could be an expensive habit. By the time we are on the eve of the American Revolution, it's also increasingly a political decision. Now, there is a common misunderstanding that America's interest in coffee rose as that of tea fell. And for a few short months in 1773 and 1774, that might have been true. One English visitor to Alexandria, Virginia in July of 1774, for example, witnessed an election of town burgesses and later recorded in his diary, in the evening, George Washington gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony. Coffee and chocolate, but no tea, this herb being in disgrace amongst them at present. Even the Boston Tea Party had its coffee moment when William Russell, who was a school teacher, participated in the uprising, emptied his family's tea canister into the fire and wrote coffee on one side and no tea on the other, as if coffee was not obvious enough that he was replacing his beverage of choice. But, but in 1774, later that same year, North Americans added Caribbean commodities to their embargoed British goods. Previously, the non-importation was for goods from England, but by then it became any goods from anywhere else in the British Empire, which means that coffee, which came from the British Caribbean, was no longer supposed to be something you imported. This doesn't mean, of course, that people lost their taste for the beverage, which is what led to the standoff of course between Thomas Boylston and those women in Boston that started off my talk. What it does demonstrate, though, is differences of opinion. In this case, between Abigail and John Adams, who are the fourth actors in tonight's story. There we go. Perhaps these actions weighed especially heavily on Abigail's mind because Boylston, that merchant, was her husband's cousin and the man after whom they had named their third child. His hoarding was, she complained, the actions of an imminent, stingy merchant, and clearly her neighbors agreed. They demanded his keys, and when he complied, they entered the property and hoisted out the coffee themselves, put it into the truck, and drove off. Abigail concluded her remarkable account by describing how a large concourse of men stood amazed, having remained silent spectators of the whole transaction. I want to emphasize these women didn't steal Boylston's coffee. Boylston had imported this coffee before the embargo went into effect, but rather than sell it, he decided to keep it in the warehouse because he knew that the longer we went without new coffee imports, the scarcer the commodity would become, the higher its price would go, the more profit he would make. Those women in Boston were telling him this was unacceptable, right? John saw things differently. Writing back to his wife, he stressed his hope that, quote, females will leave off their attachment to coffee, as it created, he argued, an untenable dependence on foreign trade. I assure you, the best families in this place have left off in great measure the use of West India goods. We must bring ourselves to live upon the produce of our own country, just in case you thought buy American was a 21st century concept. It was not. At first glance, what's happening here in Boston sounds an awful lot like the much better known Boston Tea Party, which took place only a few years earlier and pitched the efforts of a handful of patriots in their quest for self-determination against what was a vast machinery of empire. And this familiar tale has all of the necessary elements of a good intrigue, disguises and bravery and dark of night, and make that go away. And a clearly identified enemy, in this case, English East India tea, as well as a pithy rallying cry, which we get to know as children and will remember ever since, no taxation without representation, which was actually uttered by Patrick Henry almost a decade earlier and in reaction to the Stamp Act. But why let details get in the way of a good story. The problem is that most slogans like this one reduce complicated historical events into an easily digestible soundbite when the reality was much, much messier. As that showdown between Boylston and the women that were confronting him demonstrates, this time I will point out in the light of day and face to face, more than one commodity was causing problems. And while the Boston Tea Party was about limiting access to a commodity, Boston's coffee rioters were asking for the opposite. They wanted more. Colonial legislators ultimately sided with Abigail. Recognizing that colonists were unlikely to give up their coffee, they instead tried to fix a price to avoid exactly the kind of price gouging that the women were accusing Boylston of practicing. Delegates from Massachusetts met first with counterparts in New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Connecticut, but their actions were soon copied by New York and Philadelphia. And the result was, it's a catchy title, an act to prevent monopolies and oppression by excessive and unreasonable prices. And 20 goods were singled out for the public welfare, coffee among them. This is an interesting moment. Well, we can't go down the rabbit hole too far, but I just want to pause and reflect on the fact that we normally think of the American Revolution as fought because of what they thought were unfair fiscal policies passed by London and imposed on colonial American merchants. They wanted free trade. But in point of fact, there was more than one example of price fixing by colonial governments or by state governments, by local governments in North America before and during the American Revolution, which tried to control markets themselves. Taken together, this kind of legislation and public protest reveal how popular coffee had become. It wasn't just the practice of a privileged few, it was the daily and demanded habit of the many, considered as important to protect as wheat and pork and butter and potatoes. Indeed, North Americans drank so much coffee by the end of the Revolutionary era that when U.S. politicians sought to identify goods to tax themselves in aid of the public revenue, coffee topped the list. South Carolina began taxing coffee in 1783, and Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania all proposed similar legislation between 1785 and 1789. And again, it may seem ironic, given the role that taxation played in creating the conflict that resulted in a new nation's political independence, but the fact of the matter was state governments needed to balance their budgets and relied on the continuation of coffee's widespread popularity to help them do so. Where this coffee came from, however, looked very different than it did in 1776. Rather than Jamaica, the coffee most Americans drank after 1783 was much more likely to come from Spanish, Dutch, and especially French colonies, sometimes legally and sometimes less so. This brings me to the fifth person tonight, Pierre Rondeon, a free black overseer who in 1792 piloted two canoes carrying 16 bags of coffee from Roseau, which is an Eastern Caribbean island. Dominica is the capital of Dominica. Soon after he set sail, he was hailed by another vessel. Although Rondeon initially ignored the request, he testified that a musket or some kind of gun fired twice, and so he stopped for fear that either he or the enslaved workers with whom he was traveling might be killed or injured. This is from a court deposition that still exists in the archives, the National Archives in Dominica. The ship that approached, that had fired on him, was a British naval frigate, captained by a man named James Alms. And through a translator, because like many Dominicans, Rondeon spoke French rather than English, Dominica had traded hands between the French and the British Empire multiple times in the 18th century. Alms learned that Rondeon was ferrying coffee from what was then the British island of Dominica to Basseterre, which is the capital of neighboring island Guadeloupe, which was French. When pressed for the ultimate destination of this cargo, Rondion speculated that it would probably be going to North America, as it was his understanding that United States ships visited the French colony on a regular basis. Selling coffee outside the British Empire, however, without paying export taxes was illegal, and Alms asked to see the cargo's customs papers. Rondion responded in disbelief that he didn't have any such documents and that he had been ferrying coffee back and forth in this manner for many years and had never heard of anything like a permit being required. His employers back in Roseau moved quickly to handle the situation and persuaded the court that the overseer had misunderstood their instructions, and the coffee was released into their custody with a strong recommendation that they ensure proper paperwork in the future. But by his own admission, Rondion had been coordinating the movement of coffee around Dominica's coast and to neighboring French islands for years. And given the length of his employment, claims of confusion seem a little suspect. Instead, I think that these were two canoes out of an untold number of vessels and cargoes that Rondion and others had successfully piloted beyond British imperial borders to supply the coffee needs of North America. Smuggling was one way to do so, but there are many other ways of moving coffee around the post-revolutionary world and into the U.S. market. Some colonial governors turned a blind eye. Some customs officials even collaborated, doctoring papers to transform U.S. vessels into French ships or Spanish ships or even British ships. And some empires experimented with free ports, which, as the name implies, was kind of the 18th century equivalent of duty-free shopping. But special concessions and colonial collusion and even smuggling each brought their share of coffee into the early United States, but it wasn't nearly enough to satisfy either importers or consumers. Americans needed more. And to get it, they turned to the French West Indies, which accounted for more than 60% of all of the coffee sold to North America by 1789, a share that rose to 77% just 2 years later. The leading partner in this new pattern was Saint-Domingue, a place we now call Haiti, which sent less than 4 million pounds of coffee to the United States in 1789, but 54 million pounds of coffee just 5 years later. It was a spectacularly profitable business for almost 2 decades, until the Haitian Revolution ended slavery in Saint-Domingue and the American government embargoed all trade with the newly independent nation in 1806. U.S. merchants were once again searching for a regular supplier, and this time the answer was Brazil. Coffee had been a minor industry in the Portuguese colony through the 1810s, overshadowed by sugar and by cotton. But the gap created in the coffee market after Haiti's revolution resulted in patterns both there and in the United States that would become spectacularly profitable for both nations. For Brazil, it was its independence from the Empire of Portugal in 1822. For the United States, it was a strange combination of taxes and temperance. Think back to what I told you about states deciding to tax coffee after the American Revolution to raise state revenue. Their success caught the eye of Alexander Hamilton when he was arguing for federal tariffs on foreign goods, especially coffee, sugar, tobacco, and tea. Now, two of these goods, sugar and tobacco, also grew in the United States, and so taxing any of those goods that came in from abroad would help to bolster domestic production. But despite the best efforts of botanists and of entrepreneurs, no domestic option had been discovered for coffee or tea. In fact, if you want to know if we ever tried to grow coffee in the early United States, ask me during the Q&A. It's a good story. And yet it was these two caffeinated beverages that were increasingly in demand, not only by a growing number of U.S. drinkers. In 1828, no less than Andrew Jackson entered the fray, arguing that the duties on these articles of importation, which cannot come in competition with our own productions, are the first that should engage Congress in the modification of the tariff. Of these, tea and coffee are most important. They enter largely into the consumption of the country and have become articles of necessity. Once again, thinking about coffee as necessity of all classes. A reduction, therefore, of existing duties will be felt as a common benefit. And he was persuasive. In 1832, exactly 1 century after Britain's first repealed taxes to encourage coffee planting in the Caribbean, the United States became the only nation in the world not to tax foreign coffee. The following year, imports doubled. 20 years later, they had doubled again. But if U.S. importers recognize their increasing dependence on one supplier, Brazil, most coffee drinkers remained largely unaware. Instead, coffee's marketers and sellers very consciously aligned themselves with U.S. interests and images, as well as nations' expansionist dreams. Take, for example, this advertisement for the Old Dominion, touting its coffee and its coffee pots as part of the rich historical legacy of Virginia. It's not a great poem, but it's a cute poem, so I'm going to read it to you. There is a state well known to fame that every man admires, the noblest of the old 13, the state that never tires, the mother she of presidents, and it is our intention to show that she has given birth through genius and invention to something more than one who rules the people of a nation. That is a boon to bless mankind throughout that vast creation. And that was the coffee pot. Buyers, in other words, were encouraged to see their purchases from Old Dominion as more than just a way to brew coffee. It was choosing to support a US-based business with global aspirations. And John Arbuckles, who founded the Pittsburgh-based company of Arbuckles and Company, and the sixth and final person I'm introducing you to tonight, was a master at this rebranding. He'd worked in grocery retail for about 2 decades. And when he perfected and patented a glaze of egg white and confectioner's sugar to coat coffee beans while it was roasting, and if you really want to hear some crazy coffee bean recipes or coffee recipes, you can ask me that in the Q&A as well. He invested full scale in this one industry. At a time when most vendors were still selling coffee beans in paper bags, right? He began to sell his product not only roasted, but ground and packaged into reusable tins, metal tins. The company, this created not only a more consistent and better packaging, but he created a whole global pipeline. He sent agents to Sao Paulo in Brazil to cultivate relationships with coffee exporters. He invested in building Brazilian railroads to ease transportation from the mountainous interiors where coffee plantations were down to port cities where they were shipped abroad. He bought a shipping fleet to bring beans directly from Brazilian suppliers to his factories, and his innovative packaging meant that his coffee could be shipped anywhere in the United States without any deterioration in quality. His flagship brand, Ariosa, which is pictured here, became known coast to coast, its reputation growing as the nation expanded its boundaries. And it was exactly this moment of national expansion and flourishing patriotism that Arbuckles highlighted in his marketing. He developed a series of trade cards, which was a common sales gimmick in the mid-19th century, to link his still foreign-grown coffee to key events and places in the United States. And the most popular of these trade card sets became known as the MAP series. One card for each state that included facts like square mileage and population, accompanied by an image of the state's primary industry. Tobacco for Virginia, grapes for California, silver mining for Colorado, and pottery for New Jersey. And I just realized I should have looked up Connecticut's before this talk, and I'm sorry I didn't. I should have. That's shame on me. Each card also had helpful hints for how to brew the beverage. But in this sense, by putting all of this information together, Arbuckles was shaping his customers' understandings of their nation, allowing drinkers to celebrate, right, imperial expansion, U.S. imperial expansion across the continent, while drinking what they now regarded as the nation's brew. It was a masterful and very profitable sleight of hand in which coffee became Americanized. Now, depending on the time and place, coffee has been characterized as exotic, as common, as foreign, as patriotic. It is an industry that is bound up in the history of colonialism enslavement, revolution, and nationalism. The United States remains the largest buyer of coffee in the world, and Brazil remains one of its leading suppliers. This web of interdependence is now 2 centuries old, and it generated $8.2 billion with a B for the United States last year. This is the story of Coffee Nation, an Ethiopian plant transplanted first to the East Indies before becoming a Caribbean staple crop produced by thousands of enslaved people. The same beverage growing into a leading import of North America, and how coffee and coffee houses became embroiled in revolutionary activity and places of business and political protest, and ultimately how the United States invested heavily in the products of other nations, first in the West Indies and then in Brazil, to create a global coffee network on which it depends to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was amazing. I learned so much. I have lots of questions, but I'm going to let it open it up to our guests first. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. Give everybody a minute to think. While people are hopefully typing, I'm going to ask actually a question. You mentioned that one of your earliest slides had an image about ground coffee. When was it common to people to purchase coffee already ground
That
rather
really
than
is a
roasting it themselves at home?
Right, right. That's really a 19th century innovation. So you can see coffee. I mean, and this is where the lovely thing about this work is that you find all these little bits and pieces that you have to stitch together in kind of a historic quilt. But we have references going back to the 17th century about coffee roasters and coffee grinders. But coffee itself was much more durable. It still is actually in bean form. Once you begin to grind it, right, you already are beginning to affect the flavor. And that was relatively well understood early on. And so to buy ground coffee doesn't really start until the 1830s. Before that, you would buy it in beans. You could buy it either green, it would be sold as green coffee if you were going to roast it yourself. Or you could have a variety of different kinds of roasts, and even by the third quarter of the 18th century, by the Revolutionary era, there were real understandings about differences in taste. That coffee from Jamaica tasted different than coffee from Saint-Domingue, which tasted different than coffee from Java. Um, or from mocha. And so there was already gradations that would affect price as well. You do also see, last thing about grinding while I'm thinking about it, the one of the things I measure in the post-revolutionary period to get a sense of how popular coffee is the number of patents that show up. So there's patents for coffee roasters, there's patents for coffee grinders, and there's patents for coffee cut pots that show up really by the 17 well, almost as soon as the patent. I think the third patent issued was for a coffee roaster. And so I started counting. Sadly, many of the early patent records were lost in a fire, but a list of what was actually patented is still available. And so you see this significant upsurge in the number of people who are investing in trying to create more and more refined equipment to make coffee taste better, last longer, and easier to serve.
We do have a whole section in the exhibit, one particular gentleman, William Boardman, who made it his mission to make a better cup of coffee, and he was exploring different roasting methods and blending methods, but that was a little bit later. That was maybe the early 1840s.
Hmm.
And of course, the industry of making, grinding mills and all sorts of different things, big in Connecticut as well.
Hmm.
We do have several questions. So Gloria has a question, wondering if you have, and I have a question I want to tack onto this myself. Do you have a picture of the cups that would match the fruit or vegetable coffee pot? We all
I
have a good image of a teacup in our head, but what would a coffee cup maybe look like?
They really varied. So, Gloria, to your question, I do. I don't have it readily available in my PowerPoint, but I will tell you. So, yes, they did make vegetable cups and saucers that would match those really elaborately decorated and molded ceramic vegetable wares. But I will tell you that your vision of a teacup or a coffee cup might not be as firm and set as you think it might be. So, one of the things I noticed is that there are different kinds of um, there are different kinds of, in the newspaper advertisements, there's different kinds of coffee cups. There's what's called breakfast coffee cups, which are larger. And then there's supper coffee cups, which are smaller. And then there's also coffee cups with and without handles, right? So sometimes I thought, well, a tea will be like a tea bowl, like an Asian, like a Chinese bowl. No, you could get them in a variety of different ways. Um, and so where this begins to change is by the 1790s, turn of the 19th century. And there I have a different argument in a chapter where I'm talking about how popular and common coffee is. For example, one of the things I noticed was in recipe books, not just recipes for coffee, but recipes for other things, like a carrot cake or a pound cake. People would say you start with, 2 coffee cups of butter. Well, that assumes two things. It assumes one, that people are going to have a coffee cup to measure, right? So they become that ubiquitous. And two, that they're going to be fairly standard in size by then. Otherwise, that's not an especially helpful measurement. But you begin to see this information showing up in various ways. I can see Terry's question. Can I take that one?
Absolutely. I
Jane Shippen was not a direct sister to Peggy, but she was part of the same family, yes, as Peggy Shippen, who was Benedict Arnold's wife. So you are absolutely right to cotton onto that name.
Nicole's
And we
asking,
have,
oh,
go
go
ahead. I'm
ahead.
sorry. We have some of the Shippen family papers at the American Philosophical Society, and we have materials related to Benedict Arnold. It is a fascinating, fascinating series of
And
stories.
any of their coded letters from Peggy to
No, I don't have at least I haven't seen the coded letters. What I do have though is we have after Arnold was convicted, there was an auction of all of his household wares, including actually a coffee pot. Yeah.
So Nicole's asking, when does cappuccino and espresso reach the US?
Okay. So early variants, not that's a 20th century story, unless you were trying something like Viennese coffee. Um, Turkish coffee was different. So I will tell you this. So early brews, there's so many recipes for coffee. Early brews of coffee, when it was first coming into Western Europe, and then across the ocean to the Americas, they would have what was called Turkish coffee, which still is, very thick, dark coffee that would be flavored with things like cinnamon or star anise. And it was really dense. It was like an espresso. When you again, early as the early 18th century, when you begin to have coffee houses showing up in England, in France, in Vienna, in Holland, each of them had slightly different takes on how they would prepare their coffee. Viennese coffee, much smaller, much darker. English coffee served in larger capacities. And those differences persist well into the 18th century. There's a really lovely letter. I can tell you, since all of these are little bits and pieces across time, whenever you find a letter where someone's describing coffee, that would be a very exciting moment in my day. But there's a really wonderful letter by a French military officer who's touring North America during the Revolution named Chastellux. And he stops and his letter says something akin to, I'm paraphrasing, um, we've moved through the backcountry. We've had lovely meals. We've almost grown accustomed to this American way of drinking coffee. And initially, I thought he was referring to the fact that coffee could be served there's a couple of really great diaries. Coffee could be served in the morning. It could be served at lunch. It could be served at the afternoon. It could be served after dinner. It could be served really almost any time of day. There were multiple opportunities for coffee. But in point of fact, if you kept reading his correspondence, he was referring to the American way of brewing coffee. Because he said it would take 2 cups of American coffee to equal 1 French cup of coffee, because we brew it so much lighter than they do.
Inefficient.
But milk, just to speak to the question of cappuccino, milk, honey, they show up as additives early on. There's 17th century letters about the use of milk as an additive to coffee. But there's also weird things. I mean, I'd mentioned the eggshells or the egg whites in the roasting. Eggshells, isinglass, which is made by the clarified bladders of sturgeon. Those were all added as a way of clarifying coffee, which does not sound terribly appetizing to me.
No, not at all. Mary has a question. Of course, now there's an effort to revive shade-grown coffee to protect migratory bird habitat. But do you know when there was the shift from coffee as a crop that grows in the shady forest to cultivated coffee?
I do. That primarily happened at the beginning of the 20th century. And the reason why is throughout the period of time that I'm dealing with, when I'm talking about coffee, I'm talking exclusively about Arabica coffee. That was the only varietal that was grown. By the 20th century, there's more and more experimentation with Robusta coffee. And like its name implies, it can grow in a wider variety of climates and biogeographies. It can be grown at much lower elevations and in much larger quantities. And so the majority of what you get from even some Brazilian coffee, but most Brazilian coffee is still Arabica. But places like in East Asia that grow coffee, or almost Vietnam is a massive producer of coffee. They're growing Robusta coffee in those locations. And so when you see coffee basically coming down the mountainside, that is when you see it shift uh, from what had been exclusively an elevation issue for coffee production in mountain areas in shady areas where there's lots of trees. I will tell you, related to this question, though, I was in graduate school and first starting this project many years ago, when Starbucks very proudly was beginning to promote their fair trade movement. So fair trade and shade-grown coffee are both areas that have become of increasing interest. And the barista there very proudly showed me their display of fair trade coffee and explained to me what that meant, right? That this was a way of, and I'm not denigrating the movement, I'm just, bear with me on the story. He's like, explained that this was a way of promoting a living wage for coffee growers in various countries. And I said, that is a fascinating story. I just have a question for you. I said, if this is your fair trade coffee, what is all of this? Right? The rest of the shop.
Coffee.
And he was just, and you see his little face fall. And I thought, okay, that probably wasn't the fairest of questions, but yeah.
Well, Mary did put in the chat a link to a bird-friendly coffee program.
Excellent.
So I will certainly send that out to people when I send out the recording. But Heather has a question. Did plantations in the British Caribbean become less profitable as Brazil became the dominant source of coffee in the US?
Yes. You were spot on about that. So let me just step it up back one moment. I cannot overstate the initial what the relationship between the rise of coffee in the Brazil and the fall of coffee in Saint-Domingue. So Saint-Domingue, the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue, produced something like 50% of the world's sugar and more than 65% of the world's coffee when the revolution began. So when that insurrection, basically, I mean, there were efforts to try to create a kind of coerced labor system after their independence, but it could never produce at the same levels, of course, that real coerced labor under chattel bondage was able to produce. And so there were efforts. You see coffee then becoming more popular in Jamaica. There's a sizable jump in Jamaican coffee. You see it rise in Cuba. That's really the rise of coffee's Cuba and Puerto Rico. That's the other place where it shows up. But none of these places is really large enough to take on what is not only a fall in supply, but an increasing growing demand. And so it is as Caribbean coffee both falls in terms of actual production with the fall of Saint-Domingue, but in relative production to rising consumer interest, that Brazil really takes off. Those are absolutely mirrored stories. And as Brazil becomes more profitable, yes, it becomes a minor sideline industry in the Caribbean.
Hmm. Heather is mentioning that she has an ancestor that was a coffee planter, but did sell that plantation in the 19th century to
Hmm.
come to Maine. That's
Hmm.
fascinating. Lynn
Hmm.
is asking, oh, go
I should,
ahead.
let me just add to Heather. Where is Heather? I see Heather. Heather, so my better half, who is across the living room listening to me, he was born and raised in Aberdeen. So he is also a historian, and he studies. I'm a North American historian with a very strong interest in the West Indies. He is primarily a story of Caribbean history, a historian of Caribbean history, and of the transition between slavery and freedom. And so Scottish history and Caribbean history are absolutely interwoven in many, many ways.
Interesting. Lynn is asking about are the coffee plants and beans the same in the different places where they became traded? Would these
Hmm.
all be Arabica or Robusto, in which type was preferred? Um, I will mention, Lynn, we did have someone from Hartford, the person who from Hartford produced Blue Mountain coffee, Ovell. It's fantastic coffee, but yes, it is absolutely expensive. But
It
I'll let
is.
you
It is.
talk.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think I touched upon some of this earlier on in the conversation when I was talking about some of the distinctions between Arabica and Robusta. So, Robusta coffee, different parts of the world can grow different kinds of coffee. So, places like Vietnam cannot grow Arabica coffee. Planters' guides from the 18th century say that coffee grows well above 2,000 feet above sea level, and even better at 4,000 feet above sea level. And so you need to have that verticality in order for it to work. That's why coffee works in places like Jamaica and Saint Domingue and Cuba, and you don't see it showing up in places like the Bahamas and Barbados. There's no mountains. It's why it also did not work well in North America. Sugar, right? Very successfully transplanted to places like Louisiana. Cotton very successfully works in places like South Carolina. Coffee, there was my favorite. I'll do it quickly, although it's one of my favorite stories. In 1819, yeah, in 1819 initially, there was a it was a Saint-Domingue emigre, somebody from a coffee planter from Saint-Domingue who migrates to Philadelphia. And he writes a series of tracts trying to do all kinds of, he's interested in poetry, painting, banking, who knows what else. But he organizes a group called the East Florida Coffee Land Association because he had been blown off course when he was traveling from San Domingue to Philadelphia and landed in Key Largo. And so he becomes convinced that Key Largo and Florida are going to be the places where we can establish North American coffee plantations. And they will help to lessen our reliance on foreign production and stand as a place of defense against, the Spanish and Portuguese down in Latin America and the French and the Caribbean. Remember what I said. Coffee Arabica goes best at 2,000 feet above sea level, and better even at 4,000 feet above sea level. Would you like to guess how many above sea levels Key Largo is? Below sea level in many places. It was a disastrous failure, absolutely disastrous failure. So we don't have that. We have mountains. We just don't have mountains with the right temperature and rainfall requirements to make coffee
Yeah.
possible. A note on Blue Mountain. That was one of my favorite parts. I lived in Jamaica for a year and a half when I was working on this book. And one of my favorite parts about doing the research was visiting different coffee plantations. So Jamaica
Oh,
Blue Mountain is really expensive. It is highly regulated by the Jamaican government, yes, which certifies different different farms as Blue Mountain certified, but actually predominantly owned by Japanese investments at this
Japanese.
point. Yeah,
Yes, we
but
had
it,
Ovell come for one of our roasting, and we learned a lot about it. It was
yeah,
fascinating. I
yeah.
wouldn't have guessed that. We do
Hmm.
have one final question tonight, which I think is a great question, Gloria. I'm curious myself. Coffee houses,
Hmm.
mostly male customers, or were women also meeting there socially, especially in those early coffee houses, 18th century?
Depends on when you are. So the biggest distinction between, and this is shorthanding it, but the biggest distinction between a coffee house and a tavern is what happened there, right? So I was working on an exhibition with a local museum, and they were doing a coffee house installation. They said it's going to be interactive. We're going to have dice. We're going to have cards. And I said, no, you're not. No, no, you're not. No, those would be at a tavern. A coffee house. Put out newspapers. Put out newspapers. Put out some notices about, shipping, put out maybe a couple of political tracts. But that's coffee houses were places of business, right? They handled a lot of the kinds of activities that ultimately would become their own industries, like maritime insurance, and currency exchange, right? You would go to the coffee house on regular days for what were called exchange days, where you would learn how much the currency in different parts of your trading area, right, were worth. And so they were newspaper subscriptions. There were some that would have, they would boast about spending hundreds of pounds rather, on newspapers from all over the world so that traders could keep abreast of the local news, where there was military fighting, where there were changes in taste, where there was a boon in crop or a lack or a hurricane that would destroy all of these things. So coffee houses were places of business by extension. This meant that most of coffee houses' patrons were men, because I'm not saying there were no women involved in trading, and there were definitely women shopkeepers who retailed coffee, but not many of them were transatlantic traders. So they would not necessarily be importers. So by that measure, most of coffee houses' customers were men, although women did own and operate coffee houses. And in the post-revolutionary period, as early as the 1790s, then you begin to see, as banking becomes its own industry, as insurance becomes its own industry, then coffee houses are remade and they become more like the social spaces we've come to think of them to be. And then you see advertisers offering, menu selections for both men and women, offering lectures, entertainment, scientific experiments, sleigh rides, one of them from Philadelphia out to Lehigh to encourage more women to attend. But in the Revolutionary era and before, they were predominantly male spaces. But I argue it's because that's dictated by the kinds of activities that would have happened there. Oh,
Fascinating. Well, thank
but
you. Yeah.
final thing. It did depend. In revolutionary period, coffee houses became platforms of protest. Why? Because the trade regulations and the financial regulations that Britain was passing affected the activities of the people who were congregating in coffee houses. And there you do see more women appearing. I'm writing an article right now about Philadelphia's 1765 non-importation resolution against the Stamp Act. It was signed by over 300 people. Six of them were women.
Oh, fascinating. Ah, ah, very interesting. I'd be curious to know the life story of those women.
Hmm. I'm hoping to find out more.
Oh, good. Well, let us know with your next project. We will have you back.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, Michelle. This was fascinating. I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation, purchased the book, and you have a few weeks left. If you're local, please come visit us and learn about coffee in Connecticut. But thank you so much, Michelle. For our next events occurring at the museum, our next Lunch and Learn is the 27th, but all of that is on our website, connecticutmuseum.org. I don't want to take any more of anyone's time, but this was an excellent conversation. Thank you so much, Michelle.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. And thank you for hosting me tonight, Jen.
You're welcome. Good night, everyone.